Did you know that there's a Chinese god of same-sex love? You're listening to Queering Pre-Modern Asia. This narrative series features stories and discussions with queer Asian co-hosts and scholars about queerness, love, and pre-modern life in Asia. I'm your host and producer Lazu. I'm a cis-straight Chinese-American woman who spent the last 10 months or so researching and developing this series. I'm excited to be joined by my guest co-host for today's episode, Shreya Sharma.
Hi, I'm Shreya. My pronouns are she and her. I am an Indian-Canadian pansexual woman who has been investigating the corners of intersectional identity for a decade now. I also spend a lot of time thinking and reading about gods and sex. This will be evident in just a second here.
For transcripts, show notes, and more ways to listen and support, go to nuancespod.com. You can also follow us on social media at nuancespod. Content warning, this limited series explores historical contexts of love, gender, sexuality, and cultural norms. Exploration of those themes should not be deemed as an endorsement of those practices. It was a different time with different norms. This information is for entertainment purposes only. Mature themes may be explored. Some things that were normal then are definitely not now. Today's episode includes mention of capital punishment, sexual assault, transgenerational sexual relationships, explicit art, and castration. Listener discretion is advised. Now enjoy the show. Episode 5: Gods, Sex, and the Patriarchy. I've mentioned before that femininity was seen as attractive in both men and women in pre-modern Japan. During my interview with Professor Sachi Schmidt-Hori, she shared that in her view, there is a correlation between polytheism and gender fluidity being idealized.
Many societies that are based on
Polytheistic?
Yeah, that religions take non-binary thinking for granted, or they even idealize as a form of aesthetics. In the West, or Abrahamic religious traditions, there's only one God, one truth. So what is not God, what is not truth is something lesser. So monotheistic religious tradition creates not only binary thinking, but hierarchical binary thinking, because something is superior and the other one is inferior. And it also creates black and white thinking, kind of righteousness. So I think many Eastern traditions are much more laid back, chill, especially Japan. The highest praise for aristocratic men during the ancient to medieval period is, "I wish to see you as a woman." That was the highest praise. Both men and women say, "Oh, I wish to see you as a woman," as the highest praise. Even Japanese mythology, they're full of gender fluidity as an ideal form. Ichigo is just one example of idealizing something that's not set in stone, something fluid, ambiguous, and therefore visually, aesthetically kind of appealing.
Before we start, please keep in mind that there are so many mythologies and religions out there, and there's no way I could have covered them all. I apologize if your favorite one did not get any or enough airtime. My goal here is to offer a sample of stories that show how beliefs might have come about, how they might have affected views on gender and sexuality, and how they can be interpreted in many ways over generations, over geographies. We'll also see an example of how mythology was used to explain queerness. Last time, we talked about love, how it was defined, how it evolved, and what, if anything, it had to do with marriage. We also saw that in Southeast Asia, women had a lot more agency than in other parts of Asia. We also saw very liberal attitudes towards sex. To understand how pre-modern societies viewed gender and sexuality, it's worth zooming out and looking into the gods or philosophies that informed their cultures at the time. In episode 3, we talked about how in Southeast Asia, some societies had gender identities that allowed for male members to live as females and vice versa. This type of fluidity can also be seen in some mythologies of the area. In some Filipino mythology, there are female well-kept maidens who transform into powerful male warriors. This can also be seen in Hindu mythology, which I will let our co-host Shreya tell you about.
In India, the relationship between queerness in mythology and that in reality feels hypocritical at worst and dichotomous at best. While there are many examples that show this, I want to share two of my favorites. These are gender-bending, mind-bending, and surprisingly wholesome tales. Before I ask you to gather around the proverbial fire for the stories, I want to acknowledge Devadat Patnaik and his immense body of work on queerness in Hindu mythology. His book, titled Shikhandi and Other Queer Tales They Don't Tell You, check it out, serves as the primary source for the stories I'm about to unfold. Gather around. Let us begin with one of the most popular queer stories in Hindu mythology, that of Shikhandi. Shikhandi was born the daughter of a king in pre-modern India. However, this king had been promised a son by the gods, so he raised her as such. When Shikhandi got married to a princess, the woman was pretty surprised to find that Shikhandi was in fact Shikhandini. Her wife was upset, and Shikhandi's father was sure that if he did not prove that his daughter was in fact a son, their kingdom would suffer for it. Shikhandi, feeling personally responsible for this, I don't know why, ran into the forests. Here she met a yaksh, or a forest spirit, who gave Shikhandi his own manhood. Shikhandi then returned and happily took his wife to bed. Many years later, Shikhandi's gender fluidity would be cleverly exploited by the Pandavas to turn the tides of the epic battle Mahabharata in their favor. In his book, Devadat Patnaik notes that in modern queer vocabulary, Shikhandi would be a female-to-male transsexual. However, most retellings completely ignore that. We will talk about this a little more in the discussion portion of the episode. The other story I want to share today is that of Chodala. And it is one of my favorites because it challenges the patriarchal and infuriating view that men are quote-unquote smarter than women. Chodala is the tale of a yogini, who is basically a woman well-versed in the occult practices of yoga. She had to transform into a man to enlighten her husband. Chodala married King Shikhatvich, a royal so desperately in search of wisdom and enlightenment that he abandoned his duty as a king to go live in the forest. Duty is a big deal in Hindu dharma. So Chodala vowed to bring him back and put him on the right course, which is to perform his duty as a king. But she knew that he would be much more likely to listen to a man, so she transformed into one. As a man, she taught him all her secrets, especially how he can be a sage and still be a king. He was eager to listen to this amazing new teacher of his, and he learned quickly. When Chodala was sure his education was nearly complete, she decided she would test him. She transformed into another woman, one designed to seduce a man. Yet, Shikhatvich resisted seduction, staying true to his wife. Pleased with this, she revealed her true form. The king understood his folly and accompanied his pretty smart wife back to the kingdom. I'd like to believe that in this story, queerness was used as kind of a tool to challenge patriarchal bias. A woman is not seen as wise, so she transforms into a man and ultimately disproves this wrong notion. Okay, fine, you might be thinking that these are just stories and they might be morphed throughout generations. I'll give you that. But while stories may stretch or parse a truth, monuments do not lie. I'm talking about the erotic sculptures found in Khajuraho, in central India. Some of you might know what I'm talking about. These sculptures are often the ones shown in Western articles and Discovery Channel documentaries whenever they talk about sexuality, Kama Sutra, and queerness in pre-modern India. A few of these have even made it to the intro of the Wachowskis' fantastic show, Sense8. Built sometime between 950 and 1050 CE by the Chandela dynasty, the Khajuraho group of monuments depict sexual and erotic scenes of both the hetero and homosexual kind. There's men having sex with women, men having sex with men penetrating horses, men fondling women, orgies, and what have you. In a country which sometimes wishes to distance itself from its queerness, these sculptures stand tall and proud for all to see. While the art itself is beautiful, what I find most interesting is that these sexual scenes make for less than 10% of the sculptures themselves. This is not an indication of shame. The monument depicts a variety of aspects of a life that are considered important in Hinduism, to live a full and meaningful life. This makes me think that my ancestors treated sex and queerness as part of a whole life. As a Hindu myself, I believe in the cyclical nature of life. So I can only hope and believe that this treatment of sex and queerness as such can and will inevitably return. Here's to playing a small role in it.
In the last episode, we saw how in Vietnam, a number of local festivals involved sexual games, and women enjoyed a lot more agency, and attitudes towards sex were quite liberal. This can even be observed on artifacts from the Bronze Age, including a bronze jar from about 2000 BCE that has small sculptures of couples having sex on it, as well as carved images depicting sex among other normal daily activities. There's another bronze drum of the same era that is carved with pictures of couples having sex. Until 1945, many villages still worshipped the god Nonwang. In the back room of those temples, there was a bamboo no, which looked like a male sexual organ, and a nuang, which looked like a female sexual organ. On New Year's Eve, people would get together, and instead of counting down with Madison Square Garden and singing Auld Lang Syne, the village elders would offer sacrifices and lead a procession to bring the Nonwang out. The village head and the deputy village head carried the no and the nuang out, hitting them together rhythmically as the kids chanted tung tung tap, tung tung tap. After all the fires were put out, the boys and girls could pair off and perform their tung tap game for good luck in the new year. Any resulting couple that got married was bound to have good luck. It is unclear to me from the paper I read about this whether their tung tap game was striking the nonuang together or if they were actually having intercourse. But either way, it sounds like they were having a good time. Worshipping gods in the form of genitalia is common in Hinduism as well, and Hinduism has had a large influence on Southeast Asia. We'll talk more about how this shows up in Hinduism with Shreya in the discussion portion. In episode 3, we also talked about how in Southeast Asia, many societies had a concept of third gender for people who did not conform to the gender binary. These people were often shamans, believed to have special powers to liaise between gods and people. They were commoners with otherwise little political power, but their roles as shamans gave them near noble status. Remember how the Filipino shamans were generally female, though some were effeminate males? Well, not only that, but Filipino mythology had gods and goddesses who were androgynous, intersex, or hermaphrodites. For example, in Waray mythology, the supreme deity is said to be a single deity with both male and female genitalia. In Tagalog mythology, Lakapati, the goddess of fertility and good harvest, is described as having both male and female genitalia, though they tend to be portrayed in a more feminine way. This gender ambiguity is not seen as weird or negative at all. It is seen as embodying balance and harmony. Lakapati is said to be the most kind and compassionate deity who brings abundance and fertility, especially in agriculture. Children would pray to her when sowing seeds, and offerings of rice would be made to her during full moons. Perhaps the veneration of gods and goddesses like Lakapati explains why third-gender people in the Philippines were often shamans and were highly respected members of Filipino society. Early civilizations were often organized around changing seasons and had ritual offerings to a mother goddess of sorts, Isis in Egypt, Gaia in Greece, and Ishtar in Mesopotamia. If you're a millennial like me, you might have grown up watching the Sailor Moon cartoons. Remember Sailor Venus, the guardian of love? She is partly based on the Mesopotamian goddess of war, fertility, and sex, Ishtar. Ishtar was worshipped by Assyrians, Akkadians, Sumerians, and Babylonians as far back as 4000 BCE. Ishtar was associated with planet Venus, which was seen as having two genders, feminine in the morning and masculine at night. Perhaps because of this, Ishtar was often depicted as having both feminine and masculine traits, and sometimes was portrayed with a beard. She was considered absolutely gorgeous. She was said to have the power to turn men into women and vice versa. One famous story is how Ishtar came to share her husband Tammuz, a handsome shepherd and fertility god, with her sister Ereshkigal, who ruled the underworld. I hope I'm saying those names right, but if I'm not, I apologize. One day, Ishtar decided to conquer her sister's world and just showed up at the gate and demanded that her sister let her in. Now, if my sister ruled the underworld, I might have been a little less antagonizing on my way in, but I guess if you're a bearded goddess of war, you have the gall to do whatever. Her sister was like, sure, let her in. As she walked through each of the 7 gates of the underworld, she lost a talisman of power. By the time she faced her sister, she was in her birthday suit with no powers. One word from her sister, and the goddess of war, fertility, and sex was dead. So was the sex drive of people and animals. Without Ishtar, there was no sex and no reproduction. The god of wisdom, medicine, and sea was like, fuck. Except he probably couldn't say fuck because remember, there was no more sex. Anyway, he created 2 messengers from the dirt beneath his nails to revive Ishtar and bring her back up to the world of the living. Fun fact, these 2 messengers were gender non-conforming. So they revive Ishtar and flee the underworld with her, fighting demons along the way. As they're fleeing, they come across her loved ones who are being dragged into the underworld by the demons to take her place. Moved by how they were grieving for her, Ishtar stopped the demons. And then she sees her husband Tammuz, who didn't seem to miss her at all. Instead, he was hanging out on her throne, partying with beautiful women. Not sure how his sex drive didn't die, but every myth has its plot holes. Anyway, of course she loses it, so she tells the demons to take him instead. The only problem is, he was fun to be with despite his flaws. So after a while, Ishtar misses him and decides that he should split his time between her and her sister from the underworld. I guess despite being a temperamental goddess, she was a forgiving sister. This story is considered an early fertility myth that explains seasonal cycles and may have been created around the same time as agriculture in ancient Mesopotamia. If you don't know, Mesopotamia is a region in West Asia that includes modern-day Iraq, as well as parts of Iran, Turkey, Syria, and Kuwait. During festivals celebrating Ishtar, men would wear women's clothes on their left side, and women would wear men's clothes on their right side. Ishtar's priestesses were castrated males. In another story, Ishtar was impressed by a warrior named Gilgamesh, who had killed the guardian of the cedar forest with the help of his boyfriend Enkidu. Ishtar did not beat around the bush. Apparently, she said something to the effect of, "You, me, in bed right now." Gilgamesh was not receptive to her advances, unfortunately, and even insulted her. The goddess of war, fertility, and sex had what we in modern times call a short fuse. She sent the bull of heaven to take care of her unrequited love, which his boyfriend slays. This causes quite the kerfuffle among the gods, and it is decided that this boyfriend must die. Gilgamesh is left grieving and in search of immortality. This story shows that even at the dawn of civilization, gender was more fluid, love was not necessarily between a man and a woman, and if the goddess of fertility in your life is destroyed, nothing works. On a more serious note, I think it's interesting how so many myths are created to explain things that are happening in the world at the time. The next story of Japanese goddess Amaterasu might have been an explanation for a solar eclipse. In ancient Japanese mythology, the sun goddess Amaterasu is the girl boss of Shinto deities. I've seen conflicting stories about her. Part of the reason for that is that her story was modified based on the political climate of each era. Unfortunately, most of the material for this is in Japanese, so I could only read abstracts that were translated in English. The first story I heard about her was that she and her brother, the god of storms, decided to compete on who could create the most perfect kids. I love how even the most ancient auntie and uncle had a bit of that "my kid is better than yours" energy. In this version of the story, Amaterasu won the contest and her brother flew into a rage. In another version, when her brother came to bid her farewell after he's expelled for being a crybaby, she was suspicious of him and dressed up as a man to greet him and challenged him to prove his sincerity. This was done by chewing items the other had and spitting out baby gods. In this version, the brother declared victory, but remember, he's the storm god, so a victory lap was still chaotic. So whether it was out of rage from losing or out of glee from winning, her brother went on to ruin her fields, send a dead horse through her roof, and pooped under her throne. Real mature. The sun goddess was naturally enraged by this rampage and went into hiding inside a rock cave. There was no more light, and chaos ensued. All the other gods pleaded with Amaterasu to come out of the cave, but she wouldn't listen. So they decided to coax her otherwise. They brought a bunch of roosters in front of the cave, as well as a large tree, which they used to hang a very large mirror, white and blue cloths, and sparkling jewels to trick her into thinking it's dawn. Then, the goddess of dawn, joy, and mirth put on a striptease show for all the other gods gathered at the entrance of the cave. It was a very explicit show from what I've read, bearing bosoms and bottoms for all to behold. The deities were laughing and cheering and having a grand time. Amaterasu wondered what the commotion was all about. In some sources, the naked goddess told Amaterasu that there's another goddess of sun who's about to replace her, which makes her curious enough to come out of the cave. In other versions, she comes out because she wants to know why everybody is having such a good time. As she emerges, the first thing she sees is her own reflection from the big mirror. In one version, she saw her reflection in the giant mirror and was like, "Oh my god, I'm so hot." In another, she saw her reflection and thought it was the other goddess who was threatening to replace her. In yet another interpretation, some scholars argue that she might have been more transfixed by the bosom and bottoms of the dancing goddess of dawn, joy, and laughter. I don't know which version is the original, but the point is, she paused long enough for the other gods to seal the cave entrance behind her. They then showed her that the world needed her, and she agreed to go back. Thus, light and life came back to Earth. Before modern countries, governments, and democracies, there were feudal societies ruled by kings and queens who were often believed to be handpicked by the gods to rule over the people. This was true in many kingdoms around the world. The Japanese imperial family claims to be descendants of Amaterasu. Amaterasu's son is also believed to be the ancestor of several clans in Japan. In Korea, many of the kingdoms have a similar myth. In fact, the earliest Shilla society's chief title itself roughly translates to shaman or ritual priest. Each township had such a chief who would officiate ceremonies and perform other public duties. The kings of the early Shilla dynasty were believed to be able to predict the weather and were held personally accountable when droughts or floods ruined the harvest. Other than the rulers, common shamans typically were old women or mothers who could predict the future. They're often part of origin stories of the royals. According to shamanistic beliefs, spirits lived in the mountains. A lot of the myths about divine births happen there. One example is the birth myth of the Pak clan and the foundation of Shilla. In 69 BC, the heads of 6 chiefdoms got together in the forest to form a kingdom and pick who's going to be king. There was a strange light from the sky near a well named Najong, and a white horse descended. One of the chiefs found a large gourd-shaped egg at the well, and a boy, Hyokkose, came out of it. When he bathed, his body radiated light, and birds and beasts danced. The chief raised the boy, and the 6 chieftains revered him. A few years later, a young girl was born from the ribcage of a dragon, which had appeared at a well. I couldn't figure out if this was the same well or not. Historians also can't agree which rib it was, right or left. Either way, an old woman took her in and raised her to become a virtuous, beautiful young lady, Lady Alyong. When the boy was 13, the chieftains made him king of the newly formed Shilla kingdom. He then married Lady Alyong, the girl born from the dragon's ribcage. Together, they started the Pak clan, Pak being an homonym for gourd in Korean. This legend is recorded in the history of the 3 kingdoms, as well as the memorabilia of the 3 kingdoms. It implies that the Pak clan ascended over native peoples and may have indicated horse and sun worship. It's so fascinating to me how there was a time when we couldn't look stuff up, and basically, if you had good marketing skills, you could make up some origin story that explains how you descended from gods, and you can just become king or queen. I would imagine that the people who succeeded in doing that were probably pretty self-absorbed, and it's no wonder that those fiefdoms were fighting all the time. But anyway, having the gods on your side definitely helps. But if you aren't great at marketing yourself as a divine wise ruler, the gods can only go so far to help you. In this next story, we see how gods are used to explain King Haekong's queerness. King Haekong, the 36th king of Shilla dynasty, was pretty effeminate. Born in 785, he was described as a man by appearance, but a woman by nature. In his childhood, he liked to play with girls' toys. He would play pranks that women do, and he liked carrying silk purses and flirt with Taoists. An interesting tale is told about why King Haekung came to have a female gender identity. Presumably, the king himself made this up, or his father. The story goes like this. His father, King Gyeongdeok, was destined to have only daughters. King Gyeongdeok begged God to allow him to have a son because he needed an heir. God asked him if he could exchange his daughter for a son, but that would put the country in jeopardy. The man was desperate, so he said yes. God was like, okay, fine, don't say I didn't warn you, and put a female spirit into the son's body. The prince was very feminine and liked being around men all the time. He became the next king at age 8 because his dad died. And then he was killed at age 22 by his subordinates because they could not accept his femininity. If Buddhism was a video game, your goal would be to reach the enlightenment level. And the way you reach enlightenment is by renouncing any earthly attachments which are the source of suffering. Until you reach enlightenment, you're stuck in a loop of death and rebirth. Game over, start over again. Although the Buddha initially went completely ascetic, he later changed his mind, instead opting for the middle way. Don't renounce sex completely, but don't get too attached to it. Too much of a good thing is a bad thing. After being created in India, Buddhism spread throughout Asia. Each of the different kingdoms it encountered had their own folk religions or philosophies at the time, and they each developed syncretic versions of Buddhism. In modern times, most mainstream versions of Buddhism are more conservative. However, I wanted to give you an idea of how much pre-modern Buddhist schools of thought differed in attitudes towards queerness and sex in general. Early Buddhist texts did not specifically mention homosexuality at all. There is one law in Buddhism against sexual misconduct, but the text doesn't say what that means exactly. You know how a few years ago during the Me Too movement, a lot of men were really confused as to what was considered sexual harassment? Yeah, I suspect the Buddhists had similar troubles defining what was considered sexual misconduct. Some took it to mean that any sex is off limit. Others thought any sex other than vaginal sex was misconduct. Another interpretation was that if sex was not consensual, or if it was incestuous, or if it was with a nun or a monk, then it would qualify as misconduct. For some, strict abstinence rules only applied to monks and nuns. So many interpretations. One thing that is consistent, though, is how the white Christians reacted to Buddhist monks having sex with men. They were traumatized. I almost feel bad for them. But not really. I think it's kind of funny. When the Western Christians traveled to Japan in the 16th century and saw how much gay sex was happening among the Japanese Buddhists, it is fair to say they were shook. As we talked about in earlier episodes, in Japan, male-male love was not only common but was romanticized among Buddhist monks and their young, attractive acolytes. A Jesuit priest in 1596 wrote that abominations of the flesh and vicious habits were regarded as quite honorable. He was also horrified about the whole Chigo concept, which we talked about in episode 3. In pre-modern Japanese Buddhism, homosexual love was seen as less dangerous than heterosexual love. In 1676, one Japanese Buddhist scholar wrote that men's hearts take pleasure in a beautiful woman since the age of male and female gods. But the reason they become so intoxicated by the blossom of a handsome youth is because the Buddha said monks should avoid sex with women. But priests are mere mortals who have human feelings and urges, so they fell in love with men instead. And it turns out that they might even love them more than women. And now it's not just the priests, but also the warriors, the aristocrats, and the courtiers. In China, as we saw in previous episodes, men sleeping with men was the norm. When I spoke to Professor Tsun Wu, she emphasized that there was no rule against it in any of the main religious beliefs in China.
Because we don't have the religion background. No matter Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, Shinto, or shamanism, they never have any criticism towards same-sex love. In fact, the only thing is maybe is Taoism. They mentioned that sex should be between man and a woman, then that can help to make people healthy. But if it's the same sex, like yang to yang or yin to yin, that's maybe not good for health. And this theory is only appeared once in one book, I think, and never been repeated. No one mentioned it a lot. But all others, they simply never mentioned it. It's not like in the West, the Bible mentioned it, and people thought that homosexuality is a serious offense. This kind of thing never happened.
So pre-modern Chinese Buddhists didn't seem to think twice about homosexuality. Even the laws of China did not discriminate against gay rape and hetero rape.
The same thing also for law. Throughout more than 2,000 years in Chinese history, we don't have any single law just pick up the same-sex relationship. In Chinese history, if like anything involved same-sex rape or sexual harassment, usually the law document will always say treated as heterosexual rape or heterosexual harassment, this kind of word. So it's very, very different. The historical background is totally different.
However, Chinese Buddhism was eventually influenced by Confucianism, which was very conservative and patriarchal. Remember how in the last episode we talked about women being portrayed as dynasty destroyers in China? Yeah.
Confucianism, they don't like people to lost in emotion world. And same as Buddhism, they always thought that love will make people lost in themselves. And for the Confucianism, they thought if a man addicted to love or sex, that's very bad because they neglected their duty to the country, to the emperor, to his own family, to their parents. So they like to exclude any very passionate love. But they don't think that homosexuality is particularly dangerous. They actually thought women are more dangerous.
Buddhism reached China in the 3rd century. From China, it spread to Korea in the 4th century, and then from Korea to Japan in the 6th century. In Tibet, as of the 12th century, their interpretation was that oral or anal sex was a no-no, regardless of gender. Then, in the 13th century, they decided using hands was also a no-no, so I guess no masturbation in Tibet. Even today, anything other than vaginal sex is considered sexual misconduct, according to the Dalai Lama. Although he says same-sex marriage is fine if it doesn't go against someone's religion. I guess he means it's fine if you're not Buddhist? In Thailand, the traditional Buddhist accounts considered sexual desire and actions to be the result of past karma, not the source of future karma. They were understood to be involuntary. According to researcher Peter Jackson, this was the prevailing understanding of homosexuality until recent decades. Thai Buddhists also believed that the disciple Ananda reincarnated as a woman several times and in a previous life was transgender. While there are many women who played a significant role in Buddhism, they are definitely not talked about as much. Buddhism scholarship in English or European languages has ignored the voice of women. But growing up, my only contact with Buddhism was through Buddhist nuns. We had no monks on the island. Of course, the version of Buddhism we had was also a syncretic one, though I'm not sure what the other influences were. Interestingly, I remember my mom saying the eldest nun was called Apak, which in Hakka Chinese means elder uncle. I guess because in a Chinese family you're supposed to defer to the older male, and this was a way to make it easier for the men to listen to these nuns? Not sure, but patriarchal much. Remember last episode when we talked about gay weddings in Fujian? Well, Fujian is also where the god of same-sex love, Tu Shen, is from. According to What the Master Would Not Discuss, which is a compilation also known as Censored by Confucius, Tu Shen was a man named Hu Tianpao, who fell in love with a very handsome imperial inspector of Fujian province. Hu Tianpao had a big crush on this imperial inspector. He was a bit of a stalker and got caught peeping through the inspector's bathroom wall to see him naked. When justifiably asked WTF, he said he was in love with the inspector. Naturally, the official did not take too kindly to having his privacy violated like that, and had him sentenced to death by beating. A month later, Hu Tianpao appears in the dreams of a village elder in his hometown and explained that since his crime was one of love, the underworld officials decided to right this injustice by appointing him the god and safeguarder of homosexual affections. The villager then built a temple for him. Rabbits were a euphemism for gay men at the time, which is why he became known as the rabbit god. It had nothing to do with actual rabbits per se. However, with time, the story changed to include a rabbit. In a folktale version from the 17th century, his appearance in the elder's dream was in the form of a leveret, which is a young hare less than a year old. So Little Bunny tells the old man that he should get the locals to build a temple where they can burn incense to him. What kind of god is he? He's interested in the affairs of men. And since in Fujian those sworn brotherhoods, aka gay weddings, were common, the villagers were all like, take my money. Take it now. Take my money. But they didn't tell people why they were building the temple. It was kind of hush-hush. It's possible that that was because during the Qing dynasty, attitudes towards same-sex love were starting to change in China. We'll talk about that more in the next episode. Hu Tianpao is usually depicted with another man, and these images can still be seen in temples today in Hokkien-speaking communities in Fujian, Taiwan, Malaysia, Thailand, and Singapore. But most of the temple keepers believe they're brothers. There is, however, a temple in Taiwan called the Hall of Martial Brilliance in New Taipei City, which attracts 9,000 gay pilgrims each year, praying to find a suitable partner. The site of the only religious shrine for homosexuals, the temple also holds a love ceremony for gay couples. When Sikhism was created in the 15th century, it sought to address many of the misogynistic norms of India at the time. The universal goal of a Sikh is to have no hate or animosity to any person, regardless of factors like race, caste, color, creed, or gender. Sikhism has a law against dowries, considering it a vain display of wealth. The caste system is also against its principles. Sikhism is a monotheistic religion that preaches divine unity and equality for all mankind. Sikhism rejects claims that any particular religion has a monopoly on the absolute truth. We haven't talked much about Sikhism in this series yet, but it is a pretty gender-equal religion in theory. In Sikhism, women take the last name Kaur, while the men take the last name Singh. Religious obligations are also not different for men and women. Women can be leaders, warriors, religious leaders. This Shabbat from their holy text is in sharp contrast with the biblical story of Adam and Eve. From woman, man is born. Within woman, man is conceived. To woman, he is engaged and married. Woman becomes his friend. Through woman, the future generations come. When his woman dies, he seeks another woman. To woman, he is bound. So why call her bad? From her, kings are born. From woman, woman is born. Without woman, there would be no one at all. Written by Guru Nanak. The holy text does not include any writings about homosexuality, which leaves things open to interpretation. Nowadays, Islam is associated with very rigid gender norms and patriarchal rule. However, in her book Women and Gender in Islam, Leila Ahmed paints a very different picture of the early days of the religion. The Prophet Muhammad was born in a society that was slowly on its way to becoming more patriarchal. But women still played a major role in society. During his lifetime, he appointed female priestesses to lead joint prayers for men and women in each household. It was well after his death that the second Caliph Umar segregated prayers by gender and appointed male imams to head religious proceedings. While the early accounts of Muhammad's teachings were primarily written by men, a significant portion of those accounts came from women. These were usually accounts from a companion, wife, or daughter that became the reference for models of conduct. His wife Esha's contributions were especially significant. After Muhammad's death, his wives were seen as the leaders of the religion, with many Muslim men consulting them for advice. The author notes that it's pretty rare for a religion to rely so much on women's accounts and defer to women for interpreting the teachings. The first and second caliphs, Abu Bakr and Umar, both appointed their daughters instead of their sons to distribute their assets after their death. Esha, who was Abu Bakr's daughter and Muhammad's wife, was responsible for disposing of certain public funds and properties after her dad's death, as well as distributing his personal property among his heirs. This is not to say that Islam isn't patriarchal. It is. But a lot of it was added or interpreted that way long after Muhammad's death. And that's a common theme I'd like to point out with any religion or mythology we've covered today or in general. There are many ways to interpret a story, especially one that was first written down so many years ago in a completely different cultural context and edited and translated many times over since. A recent memoir I read by Lamia H., titled Hijab Butch Blues, offers a glimpse of how some Muslims are redefining their faith through a more progressive lens. And for those of you who don't know, there are queer-friendly mosques. I know of one in Toronto. I'm sure there's others. And if you want to hear more queer-friendly scholarly work on Islam, Scott Kugel is your guy. I hope I'm saying his name right. I'll put links in the show notes on nuancespod.com. So, is Christianity the lone bad boy of the bunch? Actually, not necessarily. According to some scholars, early Christianity had a quote-unquote sworn brotherhood too, which was later rebranded as non-sexual. I've mentioned in this podcast before that I am agnostic, but that doesn't mean I reject everything religions teach. I actually think most religions have some good common sense values that they preach, like, not killing people, that's a good one. But I also think there's problematic things that I can't get behind. But my hope here isn't that you all listen to this episode and become agnostic or atheists. No, my hope is that these stories help you zoom out and see how, in many cases, holy texts can be interpreted in many ways, and we do not have to stick with the most patriarchal, homophobic, or transphobic one. I'm going to bring back our co-host Shreya in a bit, but before I do that, I just want to say thank you. If you've made it this far, I hope those stories give you a lot to think about and start your own nuanced conversation about queerness in Asian cultures. This has been a labor of love, and I would be honored if you would like to show your support. There are many free ways to support the show, and there's also ways to donate at nuancespod.com/support. Writing and researching this series has been so much fun, and I want to share more of my writing going forward. I've started a Substack, lazu.substack.com. I'll put a link in the show notes, where I will share occasional essays as well as behind-the-scenes updates from the studio. I've also gotten requests to share more about my music, so I might include some of that too. It's free to subscribe, but you can also become a paid member for $5 a month or $50 a year if you enjoy my work and would like to help sustain it. Either way, I'm super grateful for you. Thank you for being here. All right, let's bring back our co-host, Shreya. Shreya, thank you so much for doing this with me. I'm excited to have you.
I am so excited to be here, Lazu. So, yay. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, let's get right into it. I sent you the script yesterday. You went through the stories. I would love to hear what your thoughts are, any stories that stood out.
I think one thing that really stood out to me was how deeply buried these myths have become in their origin. For instance, okay, so you can see that a lot of these mythologies have transformed into something else and are now attributed to more Western mythologies and pantheons. Like a lot of these, you can see that the Greek and the Roman myths have roots in these Asian and Southeast Asian mythologies, but they don't get the credit. And I found that to be the case with the Mesopotamian mythology. I also find Mesopotamian mythology to be very, very interesting. I think that Gilgamesh is one of those myths that is the gateway for a lot of people that get into this stuff.
Yeah, so many different civilizations, even though they were not necessarily connected, had very similar myths about the sun goddess or the moon god or the sea god, just natural element gods. And they all had slightly different versions of it, but very similar themes show up.
We're all just trying to make sense of the things that are happening around us. And I think that this is something that you said as well in here, that we see the things that are happening around us and we want to attribute some kind of patterns. We want to attribute some kind of power there is a comfort, right, in knowing or thinking that there's like an overarching power and there's an overarching narrative to the madness. And I think that mythology does that. And if, you know, the creation myths are obviously one of the big ones, but I think in queerness as well, it does that. And you can see that mythology lends that sort of fluidity to the concepts of queerness that it's hard to do that in reality. Not that myths are not real, but they have a dreamlike quality to them. So that helps.
Yeah. Yeah, so you wanted to talk specifically about the Mesopotamian story?
Yeah. Okay. First of all, obsessed with Ishtar. So cool. Like a bearded woman. Yeah. Absolutely. Yes to that. She does have the power to turn men into women and vice versa, which is like, I think about that a lot. I think about being able to experience being in a different body a lot, and that's kind of how you know you're queer. I found it very interesting that her beef with her sister, let's just say, and how she shares her husband with her sister, Ereshkigal, I hope I'm saying it right, who is essentially the Hades, which, by the way, a female Hades, yes. So I love how Ishtar shares her husband with her sister who rules the underworld, and he spends half the year with the underworld sister and half the year above ground with Ishtar. And this is the Hades Persephone. If anybody knows, Hades Persephone is the same kind of concept, but there's no queerness. And I love Hades Persephone, so I'm definitely not going after that. But I'm just saying that that mythology exists to explain seasons, and in this myth not just explains seasons but also explains fertility cycles, which, how cool is that? There's a really beautiful soft femininity and also queerness about it, and then you've got the great poly aspect of it, which is sharing a partner. I'm obsessed with this specific myth, and we just don't hear about it as much as I think we should, because Hades Persephone is such a big deal, and you can tell that I think that Hades Persephone's myth comes from this Mesopotamian myth and never gets credit. How are you feeling after consuming all of these stories of gods and patriarchy and sex in mythology? How's your head like? I'm just curious.
Exploding with facts. I feel like every new episode I do in the series, I'm saying to myself, this is the hardest one yet. And I definitely felt that this week as well, because there is so many, so many stories that I saw that I thought, ooh, this would be good to add, but I can't put everything in the episode. You know, it's just a sample of things that are out there. I always feel like I didn't cover enough, but also I don't want to cover too much where people are like, this is just too much information.
Oh my God. I get that. Thankfully, it's one of my special interests. So can I ask you a question? Is that allowed?
Yeah.
Okay. In your research, which one of these stories surprised you the most?
I think the god of same-sex love in China surprised me the most. That I had not heard until Edmund mentioned it when I talked to him for his episode. That one was the most surprising. I had a hard time wrapping my head around the different thoughts around queerness in Buddhism, because I kept seeing conflicting sources. Depending on which period they were talking about, there was very different attitudes. So in here, I'm talking about generally earlier Buddhism, but then the later versions, the more modern versions, they're all conservative pretty much. I mean, there's exceptions, of course, but in general, in modern times, all of the religions became more conservative, including Christianity.
Yeah, can we talk about that? I find that so interesting. Like, can we talk about how pre-modern, pre-colonial, I want to say, myths, and I would go so far as to even say religion, maybe not tradition, but religion, there was just more fluidity, there was more openness, there was more space to explore. And I will say that this is very much coming from a Hindu perspective as well, like raised Hindu, and I still identify as a Hindu on most days. And Hinduism is a relatively tolerant religion. But I just find it interesting how there was more space in mythology and in the stories. And now, even though as a society, we are trying to give more space to queer people, and queer people are also trying to take up more space and have their voices heard, somehow our myths and our stories and our religions are getting tighter and more suffocating in a way. And this is a personal opinion.
You know what this is reminding me of? Music.
Ooh.
I know this sounds random, but
Say more.
classical music, what we consider classical music, the era of Mozart, for example, right? The way it is today, the classical music world is very strict. This is how the composer wrote it. You have to play it exactly, note for note, what is written in the page. You can express in your interpretation, but you have to play the notes the way they're written. That was not how they were back in the day. They were improvising, they were playing it differently every time, just like jazz people, you know? And the same thing is kind of happening to jazz, where there is a school of thought in jazz, like not all, but there is the institutional jazz where they are becoming a bit more like classical, where there is a right way and there's a wrong way, you know? I feel like every time something is institutionalized, that's what happens, because everything gets standardized, and I guess we get the lowest common denominator.
I love that you use the word standardized, because whenever I think about colonialism, which is so often, I think about standardization. And of course, it suited especially the British to come to our nations and then use them as resources to create things that were standardized, like mass production, and then build and have capitalism on the backs of that. And that takes away that element of playfulness in any society. Like if you've read the first 2 chapters of 1984, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And the impact of that on queerness and on myths and religion even is so palpable, because we stop wanting to play around in the world that we live in. And so our stories and the content that we create and the ones that we share, that just gets less and less playful. And then that's really heartbreaking. One of my favorite writers is Dr. Sharon Blackie. She's a narrative psychologist. So she looks at the elements of psychology in myths, narratives, folk tales, fairy tales, like those sorts of things. Like, what a great job, by the way. She says this. She says, enchantment is resistance. If you stay enchanted with the world, and if you can find enchantment in your stories, if you can find the magic, then you're resisting. Like, that is the biggest resistance and the biggest... Am I allowed to say fuck?
Yes, you're allowed to say fuck.
Like, that's a big fuck you to the colonial way of thinking. I'm not going to say that's a big fuck you to certain nations. That's not what I'm trying to say. But that, like, way of thinking. It's a giant fuck you to that. So if you just keep yourself enchanted. And that's the best part about myths and folktales and fairy tales, because there's always that element, you know? Yeah, fine, maybe there isn't like an actual Ishtar. I would like to think that there is a bearded woman watching over all of us and is responsible for my fertility cycles. But if that's not true, that's fine.
Yeah. The other thing that really surprised me that I didn't know anything about was how many religions had gods in the form of genitals.
Yeah, we love a good genital god. You know, like, yes.
This is a theme. I'm seeing this in more than one place. What is happening?
Oh, I cannot believe I said that on record. And now you have that forever. You just have like a soundbite of me saying, we love a good genital god. I know that in Hinduism we have that.
It's one of those things like the sun god, you know, it seems like a lot of those ancient civilizations had them. Or not necessarily ancient, but like pre-modern.
Yeah, could be good or bad. There's that human tendency to elevate the status of sex, what we associate with sexuality. So there's a lot of myths around fertility, around genitals, around anything that's sexual. That adds a little mystical element to it. I particularly enjoyed that. Again, having grown up Hindu, I actually didn't realize this for a long time, that was a thing. So the god Shiv, of course, we see him in a lot of different forms and he presents as a lot of different things, but one of the most powerful avatars of him is a Shiv ling, and a ling is it's his penis. I'm sure most people have seen that. It's like that black dome-like structure. Obviously, it's shaped like a penis. Not dome. What? Penis is shaped like a dome, Shreya. Okay. Giving away my queerness. No.
A phallic structure, let's say.
Thank you, phallic. That was a word. I was going to say penile. I was like, that's not the word. A phallic structure. It is the most powerful structure in all of Hindu mythology. There's a lot of myths around all the other gods, like the other gods of the Holy Trinity, bowing down to that. And I didn't know that that's what that was until I was much older. And it's funny because the way that we like pray to Shiv, the way we let him know of our devotion is we water that structure. We water the ling. We either water it or we put milk on it. It's a yoni shaped, like a vagina shaped kind of opening. And then on top of that is the phallic structure. If you look up a Shiv ling that's spelled Shiv the usual way, Ling, then you will know exactly what I'm talking about. So you have the vagina and then you have the penis coming out of it. And the devotees will make sure that the penis is always wet, essentially. There is literature on that specifically, which talks to how it's not exactly a sexual erection, but it's like an intellectual and enlightened erection. Like when you have achieved, like a tantric erection, basically. When you have achieved that level of enlightenment and happiness and joy in your soul, then essentially you're turned on, I guess. Which, yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, I found it fascinating how those myths, it seems like they reflect a general openness towards sex and just fluidity. It seemed to me that sex was just considered as a normal and important part of life that wasn't hidden necessarily. Now there is a lot of shame and stuff. Thank you, Christians. Thank you, colonialism.
Thank you for the plague and smallpox, and thank you for this.
Yeah.
As well. Yeah.
All the good things, all the good things. But it was so different in so many of these places. Before Christianity, before Confucianism, I hate to say it, but my ancestors, they fucked up. But I also find it interesting how Buddhism spread, but everywhere it went, it just took a different form. It just merged with whatever the local thing was. And that is my experience of Buddhism as well, because my family moved from China several generations ago. We don't even speak Chinese. We go to the pagoda for rituals when somebody dies, or every year there's like a certain time of year that we go. But I don't understand anything the nun is saying. It's more of a tradition for us at this point than a religion. We'll do the service, but it's more like a ritual rather than actually believing those stories.
I wonder if it's because we don't question where those traditions come from. Like, I did not question until very recently, why was I watering the shivling? And then when I did, I went down a rabbit hole and was like, oh, this is what it is. But I want to come back to what you said about shame. And I'm going to bring it back to Hindu mythology only because I understand that the best. But I did tell you about the Khajuraho group of monuments that's in central India. In these sculptures, you've got all sorts of representation of sex. Sex with animals, sex between people, and different representations of hetero and homosexuality. It's very interesting that those sexual scenes are maybe like 7 to 10% of all the sculptures themselves. Mm-hmm. Because it's said that those sculptures were created by the people in 950 to 1050 CE because they wanted to explain to the future generations how to live a wholesome and full life. The other sculptures are of pottery or making something or cooking and things like that, and people going to work, and then you have like a man having sex with a horse, you know? It's just so funny to me. I'm not saying that men should have sex with horses, but it is funny to me that they're just like, oh, this is our whole life. No shame, no judgment around any of those things. No judgment when they created those sculptures and then left them as such. And now, of course, there's this fetishization and exoticization of these sculptures because they're like, oh my God, yeah, you like, have you ever seen, have you ever heard of these sculptures in ancient India where men are having sex with horses and there's gay sex, guys? Oh my God, in India, no. And that's so funny to me. You know?
Yeah.
It was put there just as this is our life. Come and, you know, witness us. And you should live the same way. And now people are like, whoa.
Yeah.
There's shame around it.
Tell me a bit about your own experience. You know, when did you find out you were queer? What was that like for you? How did you navigate that?
I know when I found out that I was queer. I mean, you kind of always know, but when it was confirmed to me, we all have our bisexual awakenings or queer awakenings. But so you probably know Priyanka Chopra, right? So she was a big part of me realizing that I'm queer. She became Miss World at 18, and then her first ever Bollywood role was she played a villain. There's this scene in the movie where she does the very famous Sharon Stone Basic Instinct. Everybody knows exactly what I'm talking about. Yeah, I don't need to tell you guys. So it's that scene, and she does a recreation of that, and I was like, oh my God. I think I'm gay. Women are so beautiful. What? And that was a big part of it. I was like, yeah, you know what? I don't notice the beauty of men as much as I notice the beauty of women. And men are beautiful and women are beautiful and like all genders are beautiful. That's not what I'm saying. But I just think that a feminine body is more beautiful to look at. And this exact sentence, when I said that to myself when I was about like 14, 15 years old, I was like, oh, I think that I'm into men and women. At the time, that's what I thought. Now I know that I'm demisexual, and there's a new word for it. It's new to me. I'm an omnisexual, I guess is the word, where you're just attracted to people's personalities and gender doesn't even play a role in it. But back then, I was like, yeah, I'm into men and women. And I kept that hidden for a very, very long time because I grew up in the Gulf and there was just no space for that. There was no place to discuss this with anybody. There was no time. When you're the elder daughter in a brown household, you're just overachieving all the time. So there's no time for mental health and personal exploration. But when I was 21 and I graduated from engineering college, I quote unquote came out to my friends and they were like, oh, yeah, no, we know. Okay, so you know? Too, thanks. After that, I stopped coming out simply because I don't like coming out as a concept. I'm letting you in by telling you about my sexual preferences. I don't owe you anything. So I don't like the phrasing coming out. That's just the way I am. I don't think it's anybody's business to know or think about the kind of people that I am attracted to or have sex with. Yeah, it's everybody's preference. And I think that that's becoming more and more of a trend or more of a thing because not everybody, especially if you are pansexual or bisexual, I use those terms interchangeably, then you don't need to come out. Honestly, you don't need to come out ever. Like, it's not nobody else's business. Yeah. So, but there is a lot of, I think being brown and queer for me and for a lot of people that I talk to involves a lot of imposter syndrome. You tend to gaslight yourself very often. And especially if your sexuality is fluid, then even more. Because you're like, oh, no, I'm not really actually bi because I've not been with a woman. That's what I used to think. And I was like, no, actually, no. There's no such, you don't need to have been with someone to know that you're attracted to a specific person. Like, nobody says that, oh, I'm not straight because I'm a virgin or whatever. That's not a thing. Yeah. So why do queer people say that or think that?
Why do you think that is more specific to brown people?
We have very few representations around us of queerness in a healthy manner. It took Bollywood such a long time, and I don't think we're there yet, to express queer love without mocking it or without making trauma porn out of it. So yeah, honestly, that's the answer. Like, you don't see people like you on screen. You don't read about people like you. You don't have anybody else talking to you about this. There's no guide. And so you're just constantly second guessing and gaslighting yourself.
Yeah. So I know you've listened to several episodes of the series already. I'm wondering, would having access to something like that have helped with the imposter syndrome, with all of that?
Yeah, for sure. Of course, some of the people that you've talked to are scholars. That's great because it's good to know that it's not something that's just happening in my head and it's something that's actually being studied and there are people dedicating their time and resources to this. But more than the scholars, just having... I want to call it a community, like an audio community. That's what I'm looking for. Like having an audio community, that's what it feels like when it comes to being queer and being brown. And you're not the only one. And I cannot wait to, and I've already shared this podcast with so many other people that face the same issue. And you know what? Something very interesting happened when I did realize that I'm queer and I started to talk about that more. People started asking me questions on how to be queer. Like, these are fellow Indians, women who suspect that they're bisexual, 4 or 5 years younger than me. I remember the day I came out on Instagram, I posted a picture of me with the pride flag, and the caption was, by the way, by the way, I'm queer. And I was like, wow, I'm making a pun. There's bisexuals, we love puns. And so many people DM'd me that day. People that I went to college with, people that I hadn't spoken to in years, DM'd me that way, telling me, like, coming out to me and saying that they're not strong enough or brave enough, or they don't feel comfortable enough sharing it with the whole world, but they would just want one more person to know. God, I'm gonna cry thinking about this. So that they're not suffocating on the inside, They want somebody else to witness their queerness, just one more person. And now I'm happy to say that most of them are out and about and living their best chaotic bisexual lives. But the imposter syndrome then worsened. And I'm really sorry to the people that are listening to this that might have come to me, maybe, because I think I'll be sending this episode to a few of them with questions and stuff. But that made the imposter syndrome worse, because I was like, what gives me the authority to tell you how to be queer? Or, why are you trusting me with this? And then I realized that they just don't have anybody else. We don't have anybody else. And we just have each other.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm really going to cry thinking about this. But it's enough. And that I have to get over my own imposter syndrome, because it's not about me, or not just about me. It's about the collective and all of us in this community. And it doesn't matter if I recognize myself. I need to recognize them, and that they recognize me is more than enough.
Yeah. That's beautiful, though, that you were an important part in those people's journey. That is so cool.
And I think that definitely fed into the mythology obsession, because then you really want to know where you're coming from, and you're like, I cannot be the first person to have these thoughts in this giant nation, the most populous nation in the whole wide world. There are other people who have thought about this, right? And that's when you start doing deep dive into mythology, and you're like, oh yeah, we gay as hell. This makes a lot of sense. In Hinduism, most houses have a deity that's that they pray to, because we have so many gods. You have a god that belongs to your house. It's called a kul devta, and that basically means the deity that you pray to in your house recognizes as the all-knowing deity. And our kul devta, our deity, she's a woman. She's the Devi. And I'm like, yeah, that actually makes sense. And no wonder that I find powerful women so sexy. Because that's what we worship at home. So checked out.
Yeah, I was both really excited to find so much that I could share with people, but also really sad that these stories have just been forgotten by the masses. There's so many beautiful stories that I've covered so far that I would have never known about unless I looked for them. Some of them you can find on Wikipedia, so that's easy for people to access. But some of them, they're academic books or articles, and not all of them are easy to access. And I just think we need more mainstream versions of that, And that's partly why I wanted to do this.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that you're a woman of color that I'm talking to about this, and the other people involved in the other episodes are people of color, because I do feel very fetishized and exoticized as a person, and then my whole culture, it feels that way whenever there's like a white man, for instance, who wants to talk about this with me. And I'm like, I don't feel, and this is something that I think that I should get over, because this is definitely a limiting belief in sharing these stories more often. But it does feel safer talking to people that are, because then I know that it's not coming from a, how can I exoticize this? And it's more of a, what can I learn about your culture and queer culture, or, the culture of the religion or the country that you belong to. So I will say big shout out to that.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to go back to your experience. How did your family react? I know you told your mom. How did she take it?
She did not think that it was a big deal, which, yay, mom. Awesome. I think that's a good thing and a bad thing. She was more like, yeah, okay. I don't know why you're telling me this. It is what it is. But I also think it's because she probably thinks that I'm definitely going to marry a man, you know? So it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if I'm attracted to women and non-binary people, because I'll marry a man and it'll be traditionally more palatable to them. And maybe I will, who knows? But I don't think that they will recognize that that was a choice. Like, I could have been with a woman or a non-binary person. I can be with anybody.
Yeah.
I think that that is probably why she was like, yeah, okay, cool. It is what it is. But yeah, no, sorry. I got distracted because I think about my friends that come out and they identify as gay or lesbian, and it's harder for them, for sure. I'm not saying it's not hard for us bisexuals, because there's a lot of bi erasure because of that reason. But I am saying that sometimes it can be easier also. Yeah. My question to you also is, can these myths be used as tools to kind of challenge rigid ideologies around queerness now, do you think?
I think so, in certain ways. I think just knowing that the baseline wasn't what the Western world decided was the baseline, right? There was a different baseline before that one, and it looked different. I think that's helpful to expand the conversation and be like, well, there's your baseline, and yeah, we all adopted it, you know, because you forced us to, but there's also these other things that existed well before you guys came along, and maybe there's space for that too. We're not saying you need to replace everything that is in Western culture. We talked about standardization before. There are good things about standardizing stuff, but there's also bad things. So how do we strike a balance between the two? And I think people react well to stories. So mythology is a good way to get the conversation going in a way that doesn't feel as threatening to people. Because it's mythology, people are a little bit more ready to accept things that they're not familiar with because it's mythology.
It's not real.
So I feel like it's a good entry point. What do you think?
I think that it might honestly be the only way to introduce a different concept from a different culture and a different time to the people now. And you're so nice to say, oh, we're not asking you to replace everything after you replaced all of our stories. I don't know. I think that some things can be replaced, and that's fine. You don't need to change all of your opinions, but you can stand to be challenged on them. And I think that mythology is a great way to do it. And this is, I mentioned this already, Dr. Blackeen, when she says about enchantment being resistance. I think that there's enchantment and magic in myths. And that, you know, my favorite element in most of these myths, these queer myths, is the fluidity. The fluidity of transforming from masculine to feminine, being in a man's body, having a feminine soul. I think we can take away that fluidity. And if we could just have some of that fluidity in our thought and the way that we approach queerness now, then that would be the biggest gift that those myths can give us. Yeah.
Yeah. To me, one of the biggest takeaways I had reading all of those stories is if you look at, let's say, the sacred texts of many of the religions, right? In theory, a lot of those sacred texts are very progressive. Or they don't even address certain things. And a lot of the rules imposed around sexuality and homosexuality specifically are modern additions to those texts. And if you just look at Buddhism and the different ways they interpreted what that text meant, I think it's important to keep in mind that, sure, there might be a book. What is important to take away is anything that is a text or a myth or a story, it can be interpreted in different ways. Just because some people interpret it as, no, we should suppress all of this, we should oppress all these people, doesn't mean that you have to do it too. You can have new readings. There's scholars who are specializing in queer readings of the Quran. There's so much stuff happening in academia that I didn't have enough time to get into because I would first have to understand all the religions, and I do not have enough time in my life. So to me, the most important takeaway is there are many different ways to read the same story.
Well said.
And maybe the most common one is not the only one. Just possibility.
Possibility. Yeah. Love that. Sweet. That's about it. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So before I let you go, I would like to ask you, what do you want people to take away from this episode?
I'm gonna do major deep dives into Korean mythology after this. My takeaway was that sometimes we see queerness in mythology as representations of something that's straight. We don't tend to take queerness at face value in mythology because there's an innate element of whatever you want to call it, erasure, basically. Some of these myths can be taken at face value. If there is a person who is described as having a masculine body with a feminine soul, they could have been trans. And maybe a word that does not even exist in the English language. Maybe there's a better word in Japanese for it. I don't know. So I think that I want to challenge people when they do read myths that have an element of queerness in them and they think, oh, this is just a representation of something. No, it could have just been an actual queer person and not a representation of a queer person. So I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, but I do want to challenge people on that. I think that would be one of the biggest takeaways from my end.
Yeah. And so many of those myths in their modern interpretation have erased any form of queerness. Like even Tuarshan, who started out as the god of same-sex love, in modern temples, most of them don't know that. They think it's two guys who are brothers. They don't think it's two lovers.
History will know them as roommates. Yeah.
Yeah, they were roommates. They were brothers.
Yeah, I agree. Don't think of it as, don't see it just with a straight lens or a linear lens even. Allow for fluidity.
Yeah, and maybe don't see it with a colonial lens, I guess.
I like that so much better. Yeah. Don't see it with the colonial lens. Scratch what I said. Mm-hmm.
Wait, is that super straight or is that the colonial version that may have been less straight?
Is that
before?
Just British prudishness Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for doing this with me today.
Thank you. I'm so excited to have chatted with you.
I'd like to thank our scholars, Professor Sachi Schmidt-Hori, Associate Professor of Japanese Literature and Culture at Dartmouth College, and Professor Tun Wu, Professor of Chinese Literature at the University of Hong Kong. Also, a big thank you to our guest co-host Shreya Sharma for sharing her story and her passion for mythology with us. This episode was all about gods, sex, and the patriarchy. The next episode will look at how the patriarchy and the gods came to be weaponized against the queer communities across Asia during the process of modernization. I will be taking an extra week or two before releasing the next episode in the series because I have a new scholar interview lined up, but we haven't recorded yet, so I want to give myself some buffer time to record and integrate the interview with the remaining episodes. But fear not, I'm not going dark. I will be releasing a few feed swaps with other podcasts in the meantime. These will be episodes of another podcast that is relevant to this series that I think you might like to check out. If you'd like to keep up to date on when episode 6 drops, follow me at NuancesPod on Threads, TikTok, or Instagram. Until then, I'm your host Lazu, and I'll be back soon for episode 6, The West, Savior or Demonizer.